the fact that certain things bother you. And you might think, I wish nothing bothered me. It's like, no, you don't really, you know, because if nothing bothered you, in some sense that would be the same thing as not caring about anything. It actually turns out to be the case that the things that bug you are the things that you care about when they go wrong. And so then this is a really useful question to ask yourself, you know, because you might be observing the political landscape and you think, that really bugs me. And maybe you annoy the hell out of your friends and your enemies and even yourself by, you know, being obsessively concerned about that thing that bugs you. And then you might ask yourself, well, why does that bug you? Because there's like a million things that could in principle bother you. And, you know, maybe you're one of those people that has a million things bother you, but probably not. There's more things that don't bother you than that do bother you, because there's a lot of things. And if everything bothered you, you'd just die. Right? So there's very selective things that bother you. And it's very interesting because in some sense, they choose you. Because you might say something like, I wish that didn't bother me. It's like, that's a very strange thing to say, because it begs the question, why then does that bother you? And also, why can't you control it, right? That's a very, this is part of the reason I loved reading the psychoanalysts, because the psychoanalysts knew, they're the first people who really cottoned on to this in a kind of technically sophisticated manner. They knew that we were, in part, collections of autonomous sub-personalities, and that those sub-personalities could take control of us. And that's really what happens when something bugs you. It's something autonomous that has a will and an agency, takes control of you, and forces you to attend, despite yourself sometimes. And why should you attend? Because that's your destiny calling you. Right? That's your problem. And that's a good thing to know, because people ask themselves, where do I find the meaning in my life? I would say, well, are there things that bother you? Yes, those are your problems. And you might say, well, I don't want those to be my problems. Like, hey, did someone ask you? It's just how it happens. And so then, why is that relevant to writing? Why don't you write about something that bothers you? And try to figure it out. Because you've got to ask yourself, well, first of all, what would your life be like if you actually addressed the things that bothered you? Right? And say, well, political things bother me. It's like, maybe you have a political duty that's calling to you. I mean, why not? Someone has to, and you're a citizen. Could be you, and not just an interest, right? And not just an obsession, but an obligation and a responsibility. And God only knows what would happen if you pursued that. I was talking to Mike Johnson, who's the fourth most powerful Republican in Washington. About 3 days ago, we were talking about the potential for young people to be involved in the political sphere. And in our culture, appallingly, most youth involvement comes in the form of protest. And that's the fault of the idiot universities, as far as I can tell, because basically what students are taught is that if something bothers them, which it might, then they should protest about it. It's like, well, you could do something about it instead of complaining about the people who are doing something. Do you believe and therefore act out the proposition that slavery and tyranny is wrong? And if the answer to that is yes, well, congratulations to you, because at least in principle, you're being guided by the spirit that pulls people out of slavery and that opposes tyranny. And we might say, well, that's good in some transcendent sense. And then we might say that God is the sum total of all things that are good in some transcendent sense. And that's not a matter of mere belief in a factual proposition. It's more a matter of, what are you willing to stake your life on? And that's a more accurate representation of what you believe than what you say about the facts that you regard as valid. And so the stories that are accumulated in the biblical corpus, which is a library, by the way, and not a book, seem to do something like attempt an approximation at representing that the highest spirit to be mimicked. That's the same as celebrated or worshiped, by the way, technically speaking. And then to say, well, it's a multi-dimensional spirit, it's complex, and so you can't encapsulate its full complexity in a single narrative. So the God of the Old Testament, for example, is not only the voice that calls the enslaved to freedom, and the voice of that which we regard as what would you say, speaking self-evident truth, like the notion that slavery is in itself wrong and that tyranny is also. Even though that's a very fundamental claim and a very important claim and a primary moral claim, it's not enough to flesh out the full nature of this transcendent spirit that should, in principle, guide us. And so other stories have aggregated around it. And so, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel, the patriarchal spirit, let's say, the spirit of logos and masculinity, is represented as the voice that calls you from your conscience to indicate when your sacrifices are of insufficient quality. And then you say, well, do you believe in that spirit? The answer is, well, do you believe that your conscience speaks to you? Do you believe that you should abide by its dictates? Now, no one can say that they do that perfectly, because you'd be a saint if you managed that, but it's a very rare person, and perhaps one that you should do everything you possibly can to avoid, who will say to you, whatever my conscience tells me, I ensure I do the opposite. And so then you think, well, you only have three choices in relationship to the voice of your conscience. You can either abide by it, or you can ignore it, or you can oppose it, and those are all acts of faith and belief. And there's no way out of that, what tripart conundrum. Those are the options. And it's not also something that you can do merely as a consequence of evaluating the evidence, because you actually don't know what will happen if you listen to your conscience, nor do you know what will happen if you don't, nor do you know what will happen if you ignore it. You can make guesses, and those guesses in and of themselves are predicated in something like faith in the propositions that guide the guesses. And so you're stuck with a decision of faith in relationship to your own conscience, and that's that. And so you see in the story of Cain and Abel that in some sense, what God is portrayed as the spirit of conscience that calls you on your malfeasance.